Hey everyone, welcome back to Left Hand again today. Glad to have you back. Today we are joined by Madeline Lane-McKinley to discuss her book, Solidarity with Children, an essay against adult supremacy, out now on Haymarket Press. It's a revolutionary feminist case for child liberation that examines the history of childhood as a system of private property under capitalism and asks what a genuine politics of solidarity with children might look like today. But before we get into it, just a couple of quick announcements from the AHRC. This summer, we're hosting 3 free public philosophy panels as part of the AHRC Agora, including one led by Emma called Should We Live in Communes? A discussion tracing the commune throughout history and asking what forms of collective life it might still make possible. And don't forget that Emma is also offering a 4-week course beginning in August called Anti-Civilization, Recovering from Industry and Progress, which you can enroll in now at acidhorizonresearchcommons.com. Okay, let's get on to today's discussion with Madeline. Welcome to Left Hand. I am your host, Surepti, joined today by collaborator and today's co-host, Emma Stamm. We have the privilege of speaking with Madeline Lane-McKinley, feminist writer, parent, teacher, and author of Solidarity with Children, an essay against adult supremacy, out now from Haymarket Books. Madeline is also the author of Comedy Against Work, Utopian Longing in Dystopian Times, and Dear Z, co-author of Fag Hag, and editor at Blindfield, a journal of cultural inquiry, and co-editor of the forthcoming The Return of the 90s, a cultural history of the present, due out in June from Pluto Press. Madeline is actively involved in several youth-based political projects, including a youth liberationist film group. Today, we turn to the urgent questions at the heart of Madeline's work. What it means that childhood, as we understand it, remains structured by the primacy of adult power, and what it would take to transform that relationship, not simply to reform the ways in which adults dominate the lives of children, but to imagine children as comrades, as fellow subjects alongside whom we face the struggle for liberation within the current capitalist conjuncture, and against the forms of sovereignty that are continuously deployed against children's lives, their desires, and their futures. Welcome to Left Hand, Madeline. We're so glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get into Solidarity with Children, just say a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, I'm a parent of a teenager. I should say my teenager is the primary organizer of that youth liberationist film group. And I have a PhD in literature and cultural studies. I'm an adjunct at several universities, and I live in Portland, Oregon with my partner. We're involved in several pretty cool projects here and have been living here since 2023.
Great to have you. And so Solidarity with Children is an interesting work because it sits at the nexus of, well, I'll say various genres or areas of research: fiction, cultural criticism, some film criticism, political theory, and it is a synthesis, we might say, of all those different modes of inquiry. Can you just tell us how it is that you came to this project? What drew you to the question of childhood and adult supremacy as the organizing problematic? And what do you think it means to write an essay that it's at once theoretical, personal, and political?
That's a lovely question. The simple answer of how I came to it is the child I mentioned before. I sometimes say there's a few starting points. That was certainly one of them. The other being my own childhood eventually came to be something I wanted to think through and politically situate, and also my experiences as a teacher, right, with young people. So I was motivated on some level to just put that practice into theory, I guess, the other way around, and to make some connections with the kind of scholarly work I'd done on utopian thought, on revolutionary feminism and Marxist feminism, on cultural criticism and film studies, to incorporate that in some way onto my thinking. I guess the other aspect of your question that I was interested in is over the personal and political reflection and kind of the genre of the book at large. I felt pretty strongly that this shouldn't be academic theory, certainly, which is not just written for adults, but a very, very specialized field of adults, right? But that this could be somehow readable for adolescent readers specifically, or adolescent readers who are reading alongside older comrades of some sort, whether they're parents, caretakers, teachers. I know there have been some reading groups that have popped up around it. So I was writing in a way that was kind of using techniques of narrative, storytelling, and especially draws on these like cultural examples or literary objects, I think, in a way to evoke different kinds of readerships for the book. That felt really important for me. Not a book for parents only, also, which is what I have observed a lot in the literature about this. And there's nothing wrong with that. And parents and caretakers definitely need books for them that are about their concerns, but that also limits who feels it's for them. And the book, I hope, feels for the reader like it's for everyone at some level, because childhood is actually a wonderful groundwork for thinking solidarity. It's something we all have some connection to through our own experience, and hopefully through the experience of caring for and helping kids through theirs.
My first impression of the book, well, I'll say that the impression that was building throughout reading the initial chapters was that the whole concept of childhood historically, and from the standpoint of, let's say, literature or film, is one that's informed both by what we might call historical reality and fact, but also fiction in some sense. The concept of childhood is almost undergirded by the image of childhood and suffused with imagination itself, for better or for worse. In the best cases, its childhood is shot through with fabulation, right? The whole act of being a child is one that's imaginative, and that's one way that we imagine being a child. So there's this whole sort of feedback loop of imagination built within the historical concepts of childhood and some of the literature that you look at as well. With that said, what do you think, amidst all of the figures that are either mediators or kind of obstacles to rethinking childhood, what did you feel was missing from the conversations that were being had about childhood, whether it's historically speaking or in this contemporary moment? And what had you hoped that this book would do that other books of its kind had not yet done?
Well, I don't know if I was approaching it on such ambitious terms. I don't want to, I'm humbled by all of the work that made this work possible before me. That said, I think one of the central concerns of the book is thinking about the child or childhood as a social construction. It's not actually a real thing, like biologically or things like that. We could break down human development in all sorts of ways, right? But it's really, its function is as a social or a political category or a subject position that people are put into that restricts them of rights, that renders them property, that renders them cheap labor and exploitable in all sorts of ways. So often in the literature of children or childhood is something that has already happened, that has a determinate ending of some sort. And I think one of the things, especially in talking about the book since it came out, that I've been really struck by is how much readers have engaged with this idea that we are all rendered children in some way, right? And that children are rather often just, I say at some point in the book, someone who's lefter than you or poorer than you, or they don't even need to be younger than you, right? But has achieved less of the class status of adulthood than you. That also elders are rendered children in this regard too, right? So I think reframing childhood as something that continues, that lurks not just in your unconscious, in this Freudian kind of way, right, of what's unsettled or unreckoned with, right, but that is actually something that you get positioned as for political reasons, right, and to use that insight for building practices of solidarity. I think a lot about that as an adjunct labor in universities, right, the way that admin will speak to not just, I mean, they speak to tenured faculty with much more job security than myself, but right, the way that administrators talk down to is obviously infantilizing, right? But the actual experience, like in term at a rhetorical level, but the actual experience politically of being disempowered in that way and being told you can't see these documents because they're too complicated for you to understand, for instance. These are political moves that we're all familiar with in our everyday lives in some way. But I hope that the book offers a way of kind of making sense of them and utilizing again some of these insights in real, direct, concrete ways.
The condition of being politically subjugated in such a way that corresponds with this construction of childhood defines my generation, which I think is your generation too, the millennials.
Our avocado toast.
Our avocado toast, our lattes, our inability to grow up and take charge in the way our presidents did. And what that brings up for me is the fact that while on one hand, this project speaks to timeless themes and deeply philosophical themes, even as you describe it as a work that isn't theoretical in the traditional academic sense. It's addressing the nature of selfhood and personhood. It addresses the way that we construct time in different sections. So there's this sort of philosophical timelessness to it, but it's also an incredibly timely project. It, I think, is super relevant to the millennial condition, and maybe that's my bias as a member of that generation. But also because, as you point out several times throughout the book, there is a particular way in which childhood is being weaponized right now. So you open the text by observing that when Israel declared war on Gaza, half of the residents of Gaza were under the age of 15. And that's just one among many ways that our consciousness has been brought to the question of childhood. You address the circulation of images of children in Gaza in this context. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about things that are happening right now that come to bear on this project.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you thinking through those different temporalities. It explains a little bit of what my mind was going through in writing it. Engaging with this thing with such a deep human history that's so complicated, that really gets at the structure of our world in this kind of permeable way. And also the kind of nonstop circulation of, obviously, images of children suffering, children harmed, children dead in Gaza, for instance, and the panic over particular kinds of children, trans children, the villainization of non-white children, the dehumanization of immigrant children that we're seeing in our neighborhoods, on the news, kind of nonstop, right? And so I was trying to think through these things. I appreciate what you're saying about perhaps that was another starting point of the project of quote unquote coming of age in this moment where guess what? You never get to be an adult, right? You're going to go to grad school and live in kind of this world where everyone has insurmountable debt, where there's no jobs, et cetera, right? Part of that was also that our generation, and I know it's not as simple as this, but especially what I was observing around me was no one was really interested in having kids of their own. And so my first few years of having a child who I had at 26, in a bit of a kind of revolutionary moment, we were involved in these political struggles, and I had a child and was very inspired by the community I was in to help me raise it and things like that. But overall, there was an almost anti-child sentiment in lots of left spaces that sometimes I hesitate to bring up because I don't really want to sound like I have a chip on my shoulder, but I a little bit do from personal experiences. But in terms of political discourse and things like that, the question of children was very much caught in the pro or anti-natalist debate and not really getting out of that. So what I'm struck by and thinking about the last few years is this is really a moment where more people on the left seem to like really care about kids and want to have some connection and see that there's stakes in having solidarity with children, and that has nothing at all to do with them being parents and choosing to have children of their own, or even the other route, which I should mention, right, is that people become teachers, right? That's the other way that you're expected to care about kids. So I think there is something really remarkable that was really kind of going on in real time as I was writing the book. This profound energy and commitment to figuring out this question of solidarity with kids that I think is really historically distinct. And I don't think it just came out of nowhere with Gaza. I think it was growing over time as we've seen the ways that the fascist creep specifically really fixates over specific kinds of kids and really does terrible violence to particular figures of the child, right, around them, right, whoever that's deemed to be.
I almost want you to speculate on why it's the case that, for example, some or maybe many or most leftists in your group, your cohort, were of an anti-natalist bent or anti-children. And what do you think constituted that shift to where things were more inclusive?
Ooh, there's a lot of things. And then I guess anecdotally have observed that a lot of folks who were anti-natalist 10 years ago seem to have children during the pandemic, which I found striking. So there's a lot of contradictions that I'm just a spectator for, and I'm very curious about why those particular shifts I think have happened. But I think really what I'm commenting on is that it was just so reduced to that matter, right? And children were flattened to a matter of a decision that one makes, right? Which is also how abortion discourse works, right? And to be able to think children outside of just that matter of a political decision one makes is, I think, one of the things I'm hoping has changed in the course of that time.
I mean, can I share something with you?
Go ahead.
Maybe this will give you some insight into how some others are thinking. I'm married, but I don't have children, and we're not going to have children. But I would say early in the dating or in engagement phase, if you will, I think it was a foregone conclusion that we were not going to have children. And the sort of unspoken premise was that this world is shit and there's no reason to bring a child into this world, which is the thought of so many people. And over time, I mean, now I've been married for 10 years, and it's not that I've reversed my decision to have children, but I have observed in myself a sort of nihilistic thread running through that opinion, that premise. And, have since, maybe I've changed my mind about it. Maybe if I were to go back in time, maybe something different would have come of our relationship. Maybe I would have had a child had I thought differently about it. But I think this is one of the big challenges, and especially for those of us who had a difficult childhood and so forth, those two things get associated. The very grim circumstances within which we live and the memory, the echoes of the past sort of coursing over all of that makes the whole idea of, for some of us, especially on the left, having children seem like such a dismal prospect, to bring somebody into this world. But I think the me of now thinks that the real revolutionary position is to affirm life. Granted, this has nothing to do with like a pro-choice or pro-life abortion argument, but just in the general sense that we would not deny life to ourselves, given the state of the world, that it is within our hands to change things.
Yeah, I appreciate that reframing. I refuse to weigh in on whether or not people should have children. I am not going to have another child, but children exist. That's really what my book is thinking about, is beside that decision. And there's a lot of people make the decision to have a child, and then they have that child and they love that child, but they also regret the decision to have had the child at the same time. And I think there's a complexity to that as well that is hard to speak to among parents who've done that. But most parents I know who are in our kind of political milieu are not very interested in like sharing the pronatalist position and telling you why to reproduce too, right? It's their life circumstance, right? Life is there. And so for whatever reason, people become parents, whether they choose to have those children themselves, as happens with caretakers. And I think that the actual everyday experience of care is really like the terrain I'm interested in thinking about. But that said, I'm going to say there was a lot of talk about one battle after another. And I'm also not going to weigh in on any of that talk. The thing that really frustrated me about that movie, which I'm going to assume listeners and you have seen, is that the actual moment of that decision to have a baby is jumped over, right? There's like this break where all of a sudden she's like 9 months pregnant, right? And that to me seems like the most interesting part of that movie or of the story potentially is like the experience of being caught up in a revolutionary moment and that also coinciding with its decision to reproduce. That was my experience of having a child. I felt extremely utopian and extremely charged with revolutionary energy and was like involved in this like student movement and living in a collective house, and really felt like if I was going to have a child, that this was a situation in which I would do it. And that was my experience of it, which I can speak to. But it's very interesting. People come up to me after the book talk and they say, "Should I have a child?" So maybe you're striking a nerve, but I want to say that's something that I'm like, I'm not going to. No, that's not my terrain. But it is interesting what people want to talk about with this stuff. And I know that these are deep questions that people grapple with a lot. Even my friends who, well, I'll say one more thing. I have a friend who never wanted to have a child and identifies as antinatalist, and realized that doesn't mean hating kids, but that there was a certain slippage for them for a long time. That having that position meant like also having some kind of resentment towards children that they encountered. And actually, that the antinatalist position that I most respect is the one that's focused on the solidarity with children question, right? Which is, why would we want to bring children into a world that's clearly falling apart, right? But that slippage, right, between the idea of the child and actually existing children, that's, I think, what I'm trying to politically intervene on. And what I've noticed also on the left is even folks who are like most interested in speaking for children and showing up for children in this ways, children are often reduced to mere ideas in these conversations, right? So how do we change that? What does it look like if we mess around with our structures, our inner workings, so that the kids could actually be an active part of it?
I haven't seen One Battle After Another, so I'm missing some crucial context here. It's okay.
Oh, really?
No, I will. It's on the list. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry to make the assumption. Okay.
On the list, I only mentioned that in case it's consequential for what I'm about to say. It tees me up pretty nicely, actually, that the matter of the decision to have kids, and as you put it, Madeline, the fact that we tend to flatten childhood to a decision. And it's almost as if our thinking about childhood has to follow one of two tracks. Either we opt into parenting or to working with children as professional caregivers or teachers, or on the other track, we disengage with childhood after we reach a certain age. And that goes along with this idea that if you don't have children, that you don't like children, or that not having children is not an ongoing phenomenon in your life, that the condition of not having children is not a way of, let's say, constructing a certain relationship to the world around you, but simply instead an absence of thought and an absence of a relationship. I know that I don't know if I would call it a stereotype, but there's this image that plagues women in particular who don't have kids, that this figure is sort of smug about the whole idea of the child. Children are gross, children are sticky, children take so much time, children ruin your body, all of this stuff that we believe that is going on in the mind of the woman who does not have a child. And one of the really remarkable things about this text is that image is completely incompatible with all of the ideas that you're laying on the table and the futures that you're envisioning. Because really, I don't think anybody, any person of any gender actually thinks like that. And maybe even if they do, maybe make an offhand remark that's sort of smug and nasty about children. I have a hard time believing that, being that we were all once children, and most of us have children in our lives in some way, shape, or form through family or something else, that people don't really think about children like that. And this is all getting toward a question about how you conceptualize mothering, because that chapter really stuck out to me. It seems to me that in the way that you are talking about mothering, it's almost as if an ideal of a future, a utopian future, is a world where we would all be mothers and be mothered. And I'm going to leave it at that, maybe, and let you sort of riff on that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a wonderful way of describing the possibility I think that chapter is writing toward. And a lot of that means dismantling the historical institution of motherhood, right? Which is another like rights-based, property-based system that excludes many who are doing the verb, the work, the practice of mothering. And so I wanted to recognize that schism so that we could start to look for acts and practices of mothering that we all have access to, that we're all called into. Partly in my political communities, there's always a mom. There's always a mom figure. And sometimes they don't want to be the mom. Sometimes they really don't. And I've certainly been that myself, as, you know, who's the default older femme in this context? Well, I guess that person's going to be the mom. I've noticed this and thought a lot about the issue of consent, right? Consenting to play that role, but also that a part of that role is atomization. It's kind of separation from everyone else, right? In this kind of way, it's isolative, and I'm interested in that breaking apart and being something that we all can kind of inhabit at different registers, right? Like what's implicit when somebody's like, oh, we're at a barbecue, that person's like being the mom, right? Is that she's got it covered, right? And what would it mean to observe that and then do something different with that insight, right? It's like, okay, well, I'm going to go and mom her or out mom her or whatever, right? What are these kinds of playful gestures we could do with that observation, which happens all the time, to just make sure that role is something that someone wants, I think is a really radical gesture that we might do. I loved what you were saying about, I'm also thinking about like whatever the childless cat lady or these types of figures. Every single childless cat lady I know is really fun to hang out with my teenager. Like there's so many ways to relate to young people outside of the framework of mothering that we get from motherhood, right? And so whatever we think about this as like being an auntie or things like that. I love the way that kind of gets casually and in our language acknowledged all the time, right? But that's also kind of a part of this project of collective mothering, right? Is making possible all these kinds of genres of mothering, right? That don't have to be all the time, nonstop, unceasing, unbearable, that can be things you dip in and out of in different people's lives. So that was kind of what I was hoping to think with. I've learned a lot from being a so-called mother, whether in like the biological, formal legal relationship I have with my teenager, but also in the capacity of I've had in political contexts and things like that. But I think just like anything, everyone should be able to see what that is so that they can understand how different spaces and groups work, right? It's like in a collective house, everyone needs to know how to do the dishes. Why is it that it's not one person's role to do that, right? But if we could recognize that at a more formal scale, I think would be just, these are like small insights, but I just wonder how much could be built out of them. Sometimes when I say these things, I'm like, I know it sounds very simple, but it actually really isn't. It involves a profound change in how we think about our relationships, but it does need to be broken down into simple questions.
In the book, you make this distinction, and I paraphrased it here, and so please correct me if I've misquoted it. You say that the histories of childhood should not be mistaken for the histories of children themselves. And, realizing now that perhaps the scope of this book isn't to make a profound argument about the metaphysics of being a child, but at the same time, it raises the question of, well, if it is true that childhood is something that's historically constructed, as you said, produced through property relations, and that's something that I think we could dig into a little bit more if we wanted to, is it possible to think that childhood exists in some sense beyond the historical narrative? Because it seemed like that's what that particular sentence was trying to say. I have to say, one of the things that I've had some difficulty with just in my path as a philosopher, as somebody on the left, is overcoming this intuition that the child is something like an archetypal given in the world, presented to us as almost epistemically formless. But of course, that's only true relative to the episteme that we actually live within. Children clearly have an epistemic reality. It just might not be the one that we have been accustomed to or are inured to as adults. But still, children are quite vulnerable. They are sometimes lured into believing things by adults who have unsavory wishes or desires, if you will. They want to exploit children. I think of, child trafficking and everything else. So with that said, how are we to conceive of the child and childhood in a way that maybe isn't universal in its scope, but perhaps acknowledges that there is some dimension to childhood that exceeds the historical narratives as we know them now? Or maybe that's simply not true. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to answer what I hear as part of the question, which is I want to abolish these categories of primarily adulthood, because I think whatever childhood is clearly like what it contains all of the wishes and the kind of utopian kernels of what adulthood has imposed upon us. That said, I'm not denying that there's development, right? That people develop, that their bodies, that their brains develop, that they psychologically develop. Part of what I hope can be broken open from, like, what if we were to think outside of these terms of hoods, right? Of childhood and adulthood, is that we'd be able to see some of the ways that we grow in different ways, in different directions. We're not just growing up, right? Which is how we often speak of childhood, right? We're growing all sorts of ways. Downward sometimes, right? Sideways, that growth happens at different trajectories. But one of the fictions, when you have a child, in fact, it begins with pregnancy. The first month, they start sending you these emails, and it's like, I have a lima bean, now it's a walnut, now there's a specific track, and then the child is born, and it's like, oh, well, your child should be doing this and this and this month, and next month this and this and this. And there's these benchmarks that are very intense during the first few years of a child's life. But we see this through the school system, right? We see this. And then there's something about adulthood, which we know also is false, which is, finally, we're liberated from this thing where we're constantly having to make these like benchmarks in school and like pass these tests or, in fact, that just keeps going as well, right? So we live in a world where development is tracked through these arbitrary, often really fucked up metrics, right? But what if we were to take from the insight that, like, yes, we do develop, and certain people are ready for different things at different points in their lives, and some are never ready. And what does it mean to be ready, right? Those kinds of questions kind of can unfold once we get rid of these bigger kind of boundaries drawn by adult child. So yes, when you say children are vulnerable to being lured, exploited by predatory people, that is very true. Also, I am too. So are other adults, right? There's a lot of the things we start to say about kids, how is that different from me, right? So one of the questions I get a lot is, well, I want to believe in children's liberation and I want for my child to be autonomous. This is often coming from a concerned parent's perspective. But children fall down. I don't want them to walk into the street. Agreed. Being liberated doesn't mean being endangered, right? But it's interesting how these assumptions get made, right? That to be liberated means to be feral, to be like unleashed, right? And to be put in harm's way of all sorts of predation in that capital A adult world. I understand that, but the thing about children is that they need to be cared for, and we recognize that, but actually we do too, right? And that involves like really messing around with this idea of achieving adult status, which is like there's some fantasy caught up in that you're somehow exempt from needing care. It's just false, right? So I think in most cases, the things that when we look to what we're most concerned about in terms of children and their well-being, right? These kinds of anxieties that come up. I think that's also how we find these kinds of critical insights into like our own need to be with each other, to support each other. So we all depend on each other, and that's not something that stops at 18, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think I just don't know what the use of these bigger concepts are, other than to discipline us, to exert power, to restrict rights, to determine property and inheritance and these types of things. And in a lot of cases, it robs from us a actual ability to reflect on where we are in our lives, right? Because maybe I just turned 40. Maybe I'm not what my life is supposed to be at 40, right?
Mm-hmm.
But where am I apart from that, right? Those kinds of questions I think are more important and riskier and spicier often.
Sure. I mean, to be fair, and just to be honest, it was all part of my provocative interviewer persona that I came at you with that question. I agree.
I assumed, yeah.
One of the things that you made me think of too is elder care, and just how I'm thinking particularly of elderly women these days, and how, I've heard so many stories from friends and various family members of women being exploited online and being lured in the same way that young children might be. And just to your point, that the concept of childhood and or adulthood doesn't really assist us in that instance. And myself, as having been a prison educator, I mean, the one thing that's interesting to me is that in the context of a certain kind of classroom where feelings are being shared and what have you, you see this very unusual mixture of like, it was all men where I taught, but this kind of flux of machismo, but then an instant like regression back to this sort of like childlike state. What seems to me to be childlike, showing some vulnerability, showing wounding, and then vacillating right back to that macho position too. I think the story is far more complex than these two simple categories. And maybe one of the ways that I see it, I mean, I'd almost be betraying my Deleuzianism if I said that childhood were a thing. Being a child or becoming a child is a becoming, in a sense. It's that which is, that allows us to sort of break through the sedimented identities and those ossified thresholds that adulthood imposes upon us. And that's one of the interesting ways that he thinks about the figure of the child. And to me, that seems kind of adequate to the task, at least in terms of what we're talking about here. But
yeah, I mean, I think a lot about it in terms of childishness. The end of my book is thinking about childish utopianism. The feeling that Emma and I were talking about comedy earlier, but I often get this from comedy of just a rush over you where, what was that temporality I was just in, right? I was taken away from my job or my immiseration or something like that, so briefly, so temporarily. But what if we describe that as this kind of childish utopianism or this childlike time that we still have access to? Because when we speak about the figure of the child, when we speak about childhood, as I said before, it is so often, and the we in that sentence being adults, a thing that is over. Perhaps it is a trauma that we don't want to ever talk about, that we're repressing, or perhaps it's a nostalgic past that we're romanticizing, or all variations of it, but it's irretrievable, it's over, right? What if it was something that we still had some form of access to call back to your initial question, which I really liked, is, a lot of this is about our imagination, right? And to be thinking about really cultivating an imagination around these problems.
The figure of the child, certainly as it comes through in your work, is where we, as ostensibly not children, place conditions and roles that are incompatible with how we're supposed to see ourselves as self-sufficient and realistic under capitalism. And this makes me think about your commentary on child activism or youth activism. You talk about school shooting survivors leading gun violence activism. I'm paying quite close attention these days to the youth-led Luddite and anti-AI movements and thinking through issues of generational conflict and intergenerational solidarity as it relates to our understanding of the impact of technology in the world. And this seems like an interesting thing to dig into because, on the one hand, from a child liberation framework, we might uncritically slide into glorifying the child activist, but it's not quite that simple, as you write.
Yeah, glorifying, or in some cases, right, co-opting, right, which is so often what happens, even for people who have the best intentions. Glorifying, co-opting, fetishizing, right? Just, again, more versions of making children and or young people's political commitments into ideas, right, in the service of our own struggles. I really love this question, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about. Specifically, the conversation that I've been enjoying having around the book is over the phrasing of protect trans kids, right? And how simple the language is. The question of language is so simple, right? But what are some other ways that we might imagine that relation of solidarity other than as protector, right? So I stand with trans kids, or listen to trans kids, or show up for trans kids, right? These kinds of reframings I've heard trans kids speak a lot about, right? Like, that actually really matters when I hear somebody use a different phraseology than this. But it means more than that, right? So one of the tendencies I note in the book is over like inclusion of children in political spaces, which sometimes just means childcare, which is often like physically marginalized in the political space. But at its best, it's kids get to be part of the political meetings, and what ends up happening to the kids in the political meetings is that they're doing the best they can to pretend that they're adults, right? And I've been a part of those things. Like, I get, it's not even to criticize those, right? But that's not the only way in which children can be brought into the fold. And in fact, like, we should be looking for more ways to be brought into their fold, right? And so I've been suggesting a lot, look at, especially for people who I completely understand, you don't have kids, you're not a teacher or a librarian or a social worker. you have friends with kids, but that's really it. Just finding ways to support stuff that's been happening in terms of high school walkouts over Gaza, over Iran, over solidarity with teachers and things like that. But high school students are so well organized and get no recognition for it. And they're working almost completely autonomously without any adult support other than maybe a few teachers. And to recognize spaces like that in which young people are being self-directed, are being self-organized and finding ways to support that from the sides, right? And figuring out what you have access to as a quote adult that would help. These are kinds of tactics that I really encourage people exploring, because I think just in doing that, you open up many more kinds of formal possibilities in terms of your meeting structures, in terms of your direct community you're organizing with and things like that. So, but yeah, I really appreciate that question.
One of the things that you bring up in the book that I think is really important to discuss is school as a social totality, or as this kind of site of a social totality. And how some families, we often think in terms of like the libertarian who wants to take their kids out of school and homeschool them. And this is an antidote to the excesses of modern culture. And for everything that's wrong with school, there may be something correct about that impulse, but often it's the case that they're resisting some of the things that we're advocating for here, right? Which is the inclusivity of non-heteronormative people in our society, trans children, and so forth. And I'll bring in this anecdote. Maybe 10 years ago, I had a landlord who was, for all intents and purposes, like a middle class or an upper middle class family, and they homeschooled their children, but they did so with an enclave of non-religious families, basically of the same social classes. They were likely seeing that the current school system was simply not delivering the goods. It wasn't socializing children in a way that was adequate to their standards or what have you. And strangely, from the outside looking in, I would see the children from time to time, and I would see the family all together. It was clear that there was, in some aspect, this was a privilege of their social class. They could do this because they had the money, the time, the resources, and so forth to get it done. But at the same time, that same grouping of families was attempting to cultivate something that our school system today was not delivering. Those families were much more hands-on. They were in tune with their children. The children themselves organized projects. The learning was based on their interests and so forth. And in your book, we come across this criticism of homeschooling, but then there's this other concept of unschooling as well. And just looking at the entire social field here today, and this was 10 years ago. Now we're living in the age where the short form video content has young people in its thrall, not to mention the intervention of AI now has created a new challenge for students and learning and their ability to engage with the learning material and to read. So there's so much more, at stake, and there seems to be so many more obstacles to educating a child in the sort of traditional way, which on the one hand allows us to perhaps intervene and as communities try something new. But on the other hand, it seems that the risks and the threats are just stacked so high these days. It's almost to the point that something like AI and all these algorithmic platforms are taking something away from children, basically acclimating them to the surveillance state and its growth in some sense. I know I've thrown a huge bundle at you here, but given everything that's at stake with the sort of collapse of the edifice of the public school system here in the United States, it being vastly underfunded, teachers being underpaid, all of the community alternatives are under threat, just given the fact that everybody's overworked and so forth. And now with everything else coming at us like AI, algorithmic platforms and what have you, what do you see as some viable alternatives or lines of flight? This seems to be an area in which you're working and doing some activism. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing and how you see what you're doing as presenting a potential antidote to the threats that are on the horizon.
What we imagine education to be is changing so rapidly. It's difficult to know what to do. And a day-to-day level, parenting a kid, thinking about these questions of education, absolutely. For me, the question isn't, I do have a critique of homeschooling, that homeschooling was in many ways an incredible way for abusers to get away with their abuse in the private home, right? That collapsing the school into the private family, as so often homeschooling works, puts many children in danger of abuse that goes unreported. And of course it does, right? Which is not to say school equals safety, right? But it does for many children present some version of safety. And I say that it's probably not through the administration. It's probably not even through the school. It's probably actually through the group of kids that they're having lunch with every day. But that's the case. So getting back to it, it's not to school or unschool for me. It's thinking kind of dialectically about this, thinking about how to unschool through schools, how to reschool. I'm joking a little bit, but the discourse that I engage in the book is that of deschooling. So thinking about, which Ivan Illich coined, but I'm also kind of drawing from a lot of radical pedagogy. The situationist Rahul Benehem has a lot of thinking about collapsing the institutions from within, right? But understanding schools as a revolutionary instrument, right? The school is, in terms of our institution, the best chance we've got to have to take over an institution of power and build revolutionary capacity. I don't need to educate anyone on that, right? The long history of that happening in campuses of the school itself being repurposed from within. So I see that happening on a kind of larger scale, revolutionary scale, but I also see that being a really important facet of what school life offers to kids. So I mentioned before high school students being like the most rad, showing up, doing all this stuff. Then why is no one noticing? I mean, people do notice, but I'm constantly online, hearing or reading people dismissing youth-based activism is like not organized enough or not properly planned or things like that, right? Anyways, one of the things that high school students have going for them, which I don't think most people actually in our world have anymore, especially because most people are grappling with a few jobs and don't have a centralized workplace and things like that, or less and less of us are, that they're all having lunch together every day, that they have a group chat after class, that they're keeping track of each other's lives, that they're making sure that each other are safe. They're calling each other on the phone because they're getting followed by a weird car on their walk home. They're showing up for each other. And these things that young people are developing with each other often dismissed, but the school is the main space where they can do that work together and extending out of the school, right? But that is the possibility of school as it is that I think can be instrumentalized and is being instrumentalized by young people all the time. So those are some of the reasons why I think we should take seriously school as a site of political work. But then obviously I feel like I've totally neglected what's clearly at the foreground of that chapter, right? Which is the long history of school being a mode of disciplining children into adulthood, preparing them for the workforce, right? Slowly degrading whatever this is that we're talking about, this experience of being a child through the course of many years, right? And that is many children's first encounter with what it means to be a worker, what it means to be exploited, what it means to be disciplined, punished in public ways and things like that. So outside of the family. And so, yeah, I hope that my kind of thinking dialectically about the school comes across though, because if the school lunch table is anything, if it's just sharing common grievances about school, that's fine. But that to me constitutes unschooling that's happening during the school hours at the school, right? And that these things can kind of bleed into each other and in fact reroute and politicize what's happening even in the most like extreme disciplinary contexts that are really depriving kids of any degrees of freedom. I'll attach to this too, like one of the main concerns I have about school is access to recess that I've written about. You mentioned things that I've worked on, but access to recess is effectively a human rights issue. Like having access to free time play is, I don't know if it's getting worse and worse for kids because of like quote technology or things like that. I'm sometimes a little bit wary to weigh in on things that feel a little bit like generational discourse like that. But what we do know is that the amount of time that kids have to do self-determining activity, intrinsically rewarding activity, which we call play, is shrinking generationally in terrifying ways, as is the amount of space that, like physical space, that children have access to roam and do things in, right? So we see these kinds of measurements are alarming to me in terms of what version of childhood children even have access to.
So this brings up something very interesting, which is the idea of schools and educational spaces, including college campuses, as at their very best versions of utopian communes. At their very worst, they're versions of prisons.
Or concentration camps, yeah.
Yeah. And this ties back into the notion that adulthood, as conventionally construed, is that which comes after childhood and is opposed to it. So as adults, we're supposed to say that the utopian commune is unrealistic, and we're supposed to do what we can to keep ourselves out of prisons and to work towards worlds where we're all sort of acting in already disciplined ways so that we can stay out of them and not have to think about prisons as they exist in our society. So it is this sort of interesting thing because, of course, in schools, just as in prisons, and to a certain degree also in the history of concentration camps, these are all sites for organization. And the conditions of these spaces facilitate that. At schools, people have lunch together. Young people have lunch together. If you're in a carceral institution, you are sharing time and space in a way that, as you point out, is increasingly not the case for adults. I am one of many, many people, including, I would assume, many listeners who doesn't have a traditional site of work that I go to. This is going to be more and more the case, I think, as time goes on, and that has implications for how we're able to connect with each other and organize, of course. We can use the fact that children are in school, in traditional school settings, or even if not, are usually being schooled, not having their schooling completely neglected in an abusive way, as a way to engage in the work of solidarity with children, using their already given linkages to each other through these structures as a way in. So the question that I have is, considering that they're already very well positioned for this, how do we, as their accomplices, to use one of your favorite words, how do we work with them in a way that reflects what they're capable of back to themselves? Because this is something that's really missing. I think they seem to know this. They seem to be acting on this. And a lot of what we should be doing is affirming this, reflecting this. So what does this look like in practice?
That's really a lovely question. I mean, I think about this at a practical level. What are the things I have access to as an adult that I can do that you don't have access to? And I can give you that access. So, honestly, a lot of the time that looks like giving rides. I'm not including like whatever, the same logic could be applied to beer. I'm not talking about that, but can I take you from someplace? I have access to money. I can give you some money. What are the, like, it seems very simple, but I do think that's the baseline, right? What can I open access to? But I appreciate part of the question I'm hearing is, how do you show kids that they believe in themselves? How do we show them that we believe in them too, right? And so I think just honestly asking questions and asking for advice and asking for suggestions. Young people are not often in the position of being spoken to in that way. And I think that simple shifts in the dynamic in that way can mean a lot. It also, finding ways to materially support. So all of the high school walkouts and things like that, they need fundraising. They need people to bring a bunch of donuts or a bunch of, like snacks or waters or things like that. I think those gestures are showing young people, I'm not trying to do the content. I'm not trying to tell you what to do, or I'm just showing up and being supportive and listening. I think that makes a huge difference. And using, as you're saying, these kind of networks that they already have in place to not just work with kids individually, but kind of facilitate spaces for them to go to and things like that. Meeting spaces, hangouts, barbecues, film screenings, any kind of thing like that, where you're not at the center of it, but it's just, again, a matter of facilitating. I think young people just don't have access to a lot of space. And that's not really new, right? But that is something, again, I think has gotten remarkably worse. So yeah, I'll give a film recommendation that maybe you haven't seen either, but it's called Over the Edge. It's a great 1979 film about these young people in a town, and all they want is a bowling alley, but the adults won't listen to them. And the adults certainly pay the price for that. I will just say that, no spoilers, but yeah, we want a bowling alley. That's a considerable and serious political demand that young people can have, right? So what is our equivalent? It's so easy for adults, but it's not something I think people feel entitled to do.
Well, Madeline, I just want to say thank you for showing up here today. Actually, one question to kind of take us to the end of this discussion, just in terms of some of the suggestions that you have offered us when it comes to showing solidarity with children, showing up for them. It seems like some of these practical, on-the-ground sorts of things have been formalized to some extent in some of the activism and community work that you do. Could you tell us a little bit about what that looks like for you? And then maybe as we sort of head towards the end of our discussion here, talk about some other projects, whether they're writing projects or more community organizing, things that you're working on at the moment.
Sure. Well, it looks, for me, in my immediate environment, I think I'll plug a project that I really love that's in Portland, which is called Budding Roses. And my kiddo is involved in that and is now a junior counselor. And they put on a completely free 2-week summer camp every summer. The first week is organized more by the adult accomplices and junior counselors. And then the second week, the campers get to facilitate their own workshops, activities, and things like that, and play an active role in that. I'm also involved in another closed camp of that sort that's youth-led and youth-centered. So I've been getting really excited about doing those kinds of projects, not just because of like the special 2 weeks or 1 week that you get to spend with those folks, but all of the things that come out of those projects. So that involved like just knowing more young people in my town who I can, give rides to, go to their protests and things like that. But it's really opened up a lot. And is also, I think, Budding Roses is a great, especially because it's free and it offers free lunch. And it's very much modeled after the Black Panther Free Breakfast Project. Is thinking about like the connection between like these simple things like sharing food and doing an art project, but then also like political education and thinking about radical history and situating ourselves in that. So I'm really excited about working on that. And am I answering your question at all?
No, absolutely. You're doing a great job. I guess the last thing I would ask is, outside of that, do you plan to continue this line of research, or do you have another book project in the works?
I do have another book I'm working on that is thinking about specifically the figure of the young adolescent girl, which comes up a few times in the book. And then, not surprisingly, in the context of the Epstein files and things like that, I've been asked a lot of questions. I spent a lot of time like really avoiding a lot of stuff around the Epstein files, but I'm also specifically as a survivor of stuff myself, but also just I find it very hard to I have to carve out time and space to look at stuff like that. I can't kind of casually read a news article in the kind of way I've observed some. But I felt like actually the cultural moment of the Epstein files really does feel like something I should take seriously and think about, and also really reflect on this experience of talking so much about these issues at the same time, these kinds of conversations coinciding. So I don't have more details on that. I don't have a contract or anything like that. It's just kind of where my research is going next, I think.
Well, it was fascinating to take a look at Solidarity with Children. And for those who want to obtain it, you can purchase it from Haymarket Books. And Madeline, if you do have future writing, please get in touch with us. We'd love to have you back on the show.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being invited on. And thanks for the wonderful conversation.